time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. South Korea is reviving efforts to advance human rights for North Koreans once again, as the new Yoon Suk-yeol administration takes a vastly different approach to the previous government's engagement with the Kim Jong-un regime. President Yoon emphatically expressed commitment to human rights in South Korea's foreign policy, which would also apply in the administration's policy towards Pyongyang. And turning words into action, the government has named Lee Shin-wha, an international relations professor, as ambassador at large on North Korea's human rights. This post was created 2 administrations ago in 2016 under the then Conservative government, but was vacant for 5 years during the Liberal Moon Jae-in years. And we discuss today the significance of this revived role and what's expected going ahead. We have joining us for this discussion Professor Lee Jung-hoon, the very first ambassador at large who was appointed to the position, who is now Dean and Professor of International Relations at Yonsei University's Graduate School of International Studies. We also have Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch. We welcome you back, Phil, and hello to you, Professor Lee. Thank you both so much for joining us. And my first question to you, Professor Lee. You were appointed Ambassador at Large on North Korean human rights on September 13th of 2016, in line with the South Korean government's North Korean Human Rights Act. Now, what was the purpose of establishing this office back then, and what were your major roles?
Okay, good morning. Thank you for inviting me. I will just remind those who are watching that the South Korean Human Rights Act, when it was passed in 2016, was very late in coming to begin with. It took 11 years of dispute and negotiations at the National Assembly, because it was actually up for passage in 2005, and it took 11 years and only passed in 2016. But finally, under international pressure, the Democratic Party agreed to go along with the North Korean Human Rights Act. And one of the number of things that the act called for was, of course, the appointment of the ambassador for North Korean human rights. And as the inaugural ambassador, my task was to raise international awareness of the human atrocities that was being perpetrated in North Korea. I also made efforts to focus on the importance of accountability if we were serious about making changes and making progress on this human rights situation in the North. We have to remember that, this is the South Korean government, and this is happening to the North Korean citizens. We should be at the forefront of the campaign to make things better for the North Korean citizens in North Korea against the Kim Jong-un regime. And yet we were very docile. It was actually the UN, it was the US, England that was spearheading the campaign. Civic organizations like the one that Phil's was. So it was very important, at least during the 5 years of the Park Geun-hye government, that the South Korean government pushed forth and spearhead this North Korean human rights issue, and I think we did that.
Mr. Robertson, well, as Professor Lee just mentioned, the envoy position on North Korea human rights, it came way too late in the game, really, but it was established in 2016 with Professor Lee becoming the first ambassador at large for that. And what really was the significance of this role for international observers and supporters of human rights in North Korea?
Well, the envoy provides leadership on human rights issues in North Korea. They make sure that the issues are always on the table when North Korea is being discussed. And, as Professor Lee mentions, the international community expects South Korea to play a leading role in this. Obviously, South Korea is a frontline state. What happens in North Korea is perhaps of most importance to South Korea, more than almost any other country in the world. And so the issue of human rights has to really be something that the South Korea government would lead on. That envoy also provided necessary leadership and coordination within the South Korean government, within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also with other ministries like the Ministry of Unification, with the Blue House and other places, with the National Human Rights Commission that also focused on North Korean issues. And I think that leadership role is very important. And also very importantly, I think the envoy helped coordinate with other governments human rights envoys on North Korea, such as the U.S. envoy on human rights in North Korea, Bob King, who was at that time appointed by the Obama administration. They work very closely with a group of governments on annual resolutions on North Korean human rights that are tabled at the Human Rights Council. There's also an annual resolution at the UN General Assembly on North Korea that also contains human rights language, and the special envoy would be expected to be involved in that as well. So really the special envoy was a leader on human rights issues representing the South Korean government, was considered to be a very welcome appointment by the international community because South Korea has so much to say and so much concern about what happens in North Korea.
The thing is, though, Professor Lee, there was a almost 5-year-long vacancy in that role after you left office. And, well, were you expecting it to stay empty for that long? And how did the vacancy really affect these efforts to monitor and mitigate human rights in North Korea?
Well, to answer your first part of the question, I did. I did expect there to be a long lull or inactivity with the previous administration, the Moon Jae-in government, because the focus of the Moon Jae-in government was inter-Korean, cooperation. It really exhausted years of efforts to bring about a peace declaration. So everything was about trying to cooperate with North Korea, and human rights issues really was a thorn on the side of the bilateral relations, and therefore it was shunned. It was considered as something that could provoke the Kim Jong-un regime, which could thwart any efforts that was being made for the Moon Jae-in government's efforts to create this peace initiative. So I expected that there would not be a successor, and I also expected that a lot of the programs that the government agency, whether it's the Unification Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, the National Intelligence, the Justice Ministry, would be shrunk or even shut down. So the ROK government, and this was part of my job, was to facilitate a series of events, conferences, symposium, whether that's at the Human Rights Council in Geneva or the General Assembly in New York, but with think tanks such as the CSIS, AEI, coordinating with the civic organizations such as the CSW or the Human Rights Watch. Working very closely with the International Bar Association. We created what I started out was Seoul Dialogue for Human Rights, and I was hoping that this will become the Shangri-La equivalent of human rights. Shangri-La, of course, the big conference on the security issues of this region. But all of that really came to a screeching halt with the change in government to Moon Jae-in government. And for the 5 years, unfortunately, there was no support to the NGOs, and none of the events were able to continue, at least in a significant way. So things will move on, particularly with international civic organizations, but without the support and without the driving force that the ROK government should have been providing during the 5 years' time.
And of course, there should have been pressure on North Korea as well by the South Korean government to improve its human rights situation, but obviously that did not happen during the previous administration. But human rights violations, Professor Lee, they're known to be wide-ranging and very much embedded in North Korean society, unfortunately. But with the pandemic situation that we've seen over the past few years, various food crises, natural disasters, and other hardships in the north, it's feared that North Korean citizens are living under greater repression than ever before. So what are your biggest concerns right now?
Okay. Is that a question to me?
Yes, to you, Professor.
Okay. My biggest concern, of course, is that there's no freedom. There's continuation of the people being their freedom being taken away. North Korea, as you know, violates every single one of the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So my biggest concern is the perpetuation of this situation unless the South Korean government and the international community really make a political decision to do something about this. Okay, so there has to be a major change. There has to be pressure on North Korea, on the Kim Jong-un regime. Yeah, some people say that, well, pressure only makes things worse. Sanctions make things worse. It's ineffective. It's not going to make any changes. Well, you know that when the Commission of Inquiry report came out in 2014, for the very first time, the Kim Jong-un government did things that really surprised the international community. For example, it went on a charm offensive, releasing the detained American citizens, Kenneth Bae, Matthew Todd Miller, Jeffrey Fowl. The North Korean Foreign Minister Lee Soo-young would go on a diplomatic tour, appealing to the European and Southeast Asian countries. They also ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child after 24 years of negligence. The special rapporteur, Darusman, was actually invited. So, and the list can go on. What I'm saying is that we felt that with the COI report, something that could really put the pressure, squeeze on North Korea, that we found the Achilles gun of North Korea, that this is something that moves this regime that doesn't budge, even with dozen Security Council sanctions resolutions. So it does work. Unfortunately, it's been shunned for the past 5 years. So it's now time to get back on track to put the pressure on so that we can actually bring about genuine changes.
And Mr. Robertson, now the South Korean government is currently investigating the previous Moon administration's repatriation of 2 North Korean citizens in 2019 after they admitted to killing their colleagues. Now, how are you following this investigation, and how do you think it should be conducted?
Well, we're following it very closely. The forced return of these 2 North Korean fishermen must certainly be investigated. It must be done independently and impartially, because what happened was a clear violation of South Korea's international human rights obligations. And this was under 2 different UN rights treaties that have been ratified by the Republic of Korea. The first being the UN Refugee Convention, and the second one being the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment or Punishment. The reason the second one comes into play was that that convention says very clearly that people should not be sent back to an area where they could possibly face torture. And what we have seen time and time again in our research on North Korea is that anybody who flees the country and is sent back to North Korea faces torture at the hands of the security services. Now, furthermore, it was really quite puzzling to us why the Moon administration sent these 2 men back, because the Constitution of the Republic of Korea sets out that North Koreans are also to be considered as citizens of South Korea. So why then didn't President Moon and his administration decide to send these 2 men to trial in a South Korean court, if in fact they had evidence that the 2 men had committed the crimes of murder of their fellow crewmen, which is the allegation that has been made? Had this been a case that was heard by a South Korean court, I think a couple things would have happened. First of all, the men would have at least been guaranteed a free and fair trial. I think that our concern is that when they were sent back to North Korea, they were executed. I also think that there would have been a lot of information that could have possibly come out about what the two men had done in the North. There's a number of narratives that we have heard that we are investigating that, in fact, these people may have been something different, that they may have, in fact, been fleeing persecution. All these issues have to be investigated now. It's going to be difficult, however, because as earlier reporting has shown, it's not quite clear how much information the Moon Jae-in administration actually passed to the new administration. I know there's an investigation taking place of some security officials that were involved in the forced return, and I think that's appropriate that they be investigated. But this has to be done in a very timely way, and there has to be a public revelation of what is found. So that this kind of abuse, so that this kind of sending people back into harm's way, as was clearly done with these two men, does not happen again.
And Professor Lee, your thoughts on this? How should this probe really be conducted?
Yeah, I think Phil has quite clearly laid down the situation regarding the two fishermen. I will just add that as part of the COI report, it has a very clear point about forcible repatriation. This is a big issue for the UN as a whole. It's not just about North Korean defector situation. Forcible repatriation is against international law, non-refoulement principles. So if you forcibly send someone back with a full knowledge that they can be persecuted in one way or another, that is equivalent to, quote unquote, COI report, aiding and abetting crimes against humanity. So if we're doing that, if South Korean government is doing that to our own people, remember when North Koreans defect to South Korea and make it clear that they want to defect, basically what that means is that they're recovering their Korean citizenship, South Korean citizenship. So in effect, technically, we rounded up and sent our own citizens to their death row, basically aiding and abetting crimes against humanity. So it should be dealt with in such a way. The investigation has to be thorough, and there has to be people found who are responsible for these heinous acts, and hopefully it will never ever be repeated again in the future.
And Mr. Robertson, finally, just briefly before we go, what do you hope to see from the newly appointed South Korean ambassador at large on North Korean human rights, Professor Lee Shin-wha?
Well, it's very good news that Professor Lee Shin-wha has been appointed. I don't know her personally, but judging from her background and experience, she appears to know the UN system very well. She served on Kofi Annan's independent Rwanda inquiry and has been involved in peacekeeping affairs. And I also consider it very significant that she has previously worked for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. What I think is most important also is that we're pleased that the President Yoon administration appears committed to the full implementation of the North Korean Human Rights Act, which was, as Professor Lee mentioned, adopted with both left and right-wing support in the National Assembly back in 2016, but never fully implemented. And our view is that the new envoy should show strong leadership on North Korean human rights issues, should engage with the international community, should encourage the Biden administration to fill their empty position of the diplomatic envoy, the special ambassador on North Korean human rights issues that the U.S. has not appointed yet. And also will work very closely with the new special rapporteur of the Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council, Elizabeth Salmon from Peru, who's recently been appointed and is taking up her mandate in the coming months. So it's good news, and we look forward to working with her.
Right, a move welcomed by the international community. That was Professor Lee Jung-hoon, the first and former ambassador at large of North Korean human rights here in South Korea, and also Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.